Dakota Territory, late autumn, 1883. Anders Johansen was digging a circle in the unforgiving dirt. Not a well, not a root cellar. A perfect, massive ring, 30 feet in diameter, centered on the single stone pier that would serve as his cabin's foundation. His neighbors watched from a distance. They saw him hauling not logs for walls, but heavy timbers and salvaged strips of iron, laying them meticulously in the trench as if building a railroad to nowhere. By the time the first snows dusted the prairie, the talk in the nearby settlement of Prairie Dog Creek had solidified. The quiet Norwegian, the one who used to build ships, was mad. He was building a house on a track. The children called it the spinning shack. The men, gathered around the potbelly stove at the trading post, called it Johansen's folly. They saw a man wasting precious time and resources on an absurdity. A man inviting the wind and the cold into a house designed to move. What they could not see was the knowledge behind his eyes, a deep understanding of leverage, of mechanics, and of the one thing the Dakota prairie had in abundance, besides wind: sunlight. What did this former shipwright understand about physics that every seasoned frontiersman, every experienced builder, had completely missed? He was not building a house. He was building an engine, and its fuel was the sun itself. If you believe that forgotten wisdom holds the key to future solutions, hit that subscribe button and join us. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from as we uncover the secrets of the cabin that chased the sun. To understand the genius of Anders Johansen, you must first understand the tyranny of a Dakota winter. It was not merely cold, it was an active, malevolent force that sought to steal the life from everything it touched. Winter began not in December, but in October, with a wind that never seemed to stop. It scoured the plains, a relentless river of frigid air that found every crack, every seam, every pinhole in a cabin's construction. It drove snow into drifts that could bury a house to its eaves, transforming the landscape into a featureless white desert. Temperatures didn't just drop, they plummeted into a realm where the very nature of materials changed. Metal became brittle and snapped. Axe heads shattered against frozen wood. Ink froze solid in its wells, and a dipper of water thrown into the air would fall to the ground not as a splash, but as a crystalline shower of ice. The standard cabin of the era was a fortress built against this enemy, but it was a fortress under constant siege, and it was always losing. They were built from thick, hand-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and dried grass. A single, large stone fireplace dominated one wall, the sole source of heat and the cabin's hungry, insatiable heart. This design was a tradition born of necessity, but it was deeply flawed. The fireplace, for all its roaring consumption of wood, was brutally inefficient. It projected heat in a small radius, creating a bubble of survivable warmth in an otherwise freezing room. To be warm, you had to be near the fire. To be anywhere else in the cabin was to be cold. Families lived their lives in a slow, constant migration around this central hearth. They cooked beside it, ate beside it, and slept with their feet pointed towards its embers. The wall behind the fireplace would be warm to the touch, but the opposite wall, the north wall, was a permanent sheet of white. A rime of frost grew on the inside of the logs, a glittering, beautiful marker of profound failure. The moisture from their own breath would condense and freeze upon the blankets they huddled under. The greatest tax of this life was the woodpile. A family's survival through the winter was measured in cords of wood. The task of felling, splitting, and stacking this fuel was a year-round occupation. During a cold snap, the consumption was terrifying. A man might spend a full day in the biting wind, risking frostbite and exhaustion, just to gather enough wood to keep his family from freezing for the next 48 hours. Anders Johansen had seen this struggle during his first winter. He had built his own temporary shelter in the traditional way, and he had felt its failures firsthand. He watched his neighbors, good, strong, hard-working men, wear themselves down in a battle of attrition they could never truly win. They were fighting the cold. Anders realized that was the wrong approach. You didn't fight the cold, you invited the warmth. His background was not in houses, but in ships. In Bergen, Norway, he had been a shipwright, a master of complex mechanics in a world of wood, iron, and rope. He knew how to build a capstan, a device that allowed a few men to move a weight of many tons using the simple power of the lever and the gear. He knew how to design a rudder that could turn a massive vessel against the force of the sea. He understood stress, load-bearing, and the distribution of weight. More importantly, he came from a land of long, dark winters. He understood the precious, life-giving power of a low winter sun. In Norway, they built homes to capture every possible ray of light. Here in the Dakotas, the sun was seen as a thing of summer. In winter, it was a distant, cold disk in the sky. The settlers built their cabins with small windows to keep the cold out, never thinking that those same windows could be used to let the warmth in. Anders saw two fundamental resources being wasted: the mechanical power of leverage and the thermal power of the sun. In his mind, a new kind of structure began to take shape. A house that didn't just sit there and endure the winter, but actively participated in its own survival. A house that could turn. The build began in the late summer of 1883. It became the settlement's primary source of entertainment and gossip. The first stage was the foundation, and it was unlike any other. Instead of a rectangular stone footing, Anders dug a deep, central hole and filled it with rock and mortar, creating a massive, immovable pillar 5 feet in diameter. This was the pivot, the anchor. Then came the circle. With the central pier as his axis, he laid out the 30-foot ring. He dug the trench a foot deep and leveled it with painstaking precision. Into this trench went the smoothed timbers, laid on their side like railroad ties. On top of those, he fastened thin strips of iron he had scavenged from a broken-down freight wagon. The entire ring was then coated in a thick layer of tallow and grease. This was the bearing. Upon this greasy ring, he constructed the chassis. It was a marvel of woodworking, a giant cross-braced frame of the thickest timbers he could find. It looked like a massive wooden asterisk, with 8 arms radiating from a central hole that fit loosely around the stone pier. At the end of each arm, he fitted a grooved iron wheel, salvaged from old farm equipment. The entire cabin would rest on this mobile platform. This was the point when Elias Thorne paid his first visit. Thorne was the community's undisputed expert on building. A tall, grim man with hands like worn leather, he had built nearly every permanent structure in the area. His cabins were known for their tight joinery and their ability to withstand the wind. He was not a man given to idle speculation. He dealt in the hard realities of wood and winter. He stood watching Anders hoist one of the massive chassis beams into place. He chewed on a piece of straw, his eyes missing nothing. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and certain. "Johansen," he began, not unkindly, "that track of yours will be a ruin by January." Anders paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He nodded for Elias to continue. "The frost here goes 4 feet deep," Elias stated, as if teaching a child. "The ground will heave. It's not flat. One side of your ring will lift, the other will sink. Your house will jam itself crooked before the new year. You're building on a broken plate." It was a sound, logical objection. Frost heave was the bane of every builder on the prairie. Anders simply pointed to the deep trench. "I dug below the frost line and filled it with gravel for drainage," he said. "The water will not stay to freeze." Elias grunted, unconvinced. "Even so, The gap you need to let this thing turn, the wind will come up from underneath you. It will tear the heat right out of your floor. You're building on a sieve. The floor will be double layered with packed wool in between, Anders replied, his voice calm and even. And I will have skirts to cover the gap. Elias shook his head, his patience wearing thin. He gestured toward the pile of window frames Anders had already built. They were huge, far larger than any sensible person would use. And that glass is death in winter. Every square inch is a hole where the warmth bleeds out. You're building an icebox for your family, man. This was the core of the community's disbelief. In a land where heat was the most valuable commodity, Anders Johansen was planning a wall made largely of glass. Anders looked at Elias, his expression not of defiance, but of simple conviction. The sun gives its heat for free, he said quietly. I plan to take it. Elias Thorne spat the straw from his mouth. You're a fool, he said, not with malice, but with the weary finality of an expert stating a fact. He turned and walked away. The matter settled in his mind. The mockery grew louder after that. Johansen's folly was too tame. It became the spinning shack, or the glass coffin. Men at the trading post would make bets on which month it would collapse or when the Johansen family would be forced to seek shelter with their more sensible neighbors. Anders ignored it all. He worked from sunup to sundown, his focus absolute. The cabin itself went up on the chassis. The construction was meticulous, but it was asymmetrical. One long wall, the south-facing wall, was dominated by the three enormous windows. The opposite wall, the north wall, was thick, with no openings at all. The east and west walls had only a single small window each, and the main door. Inside, the floor was made of dark, flat stones he had hauled from the creek bed. The thick north wall was plastered on the interior with a dark, dense mixture of clay and mud. Finally, he installed the turning mechanism. It was a beautiful piece of shipwright's craft. A large iron gear ring was fixed to the stationary central pier. A smaller gear on the cabin's chassis meshed with it. This smaller gear was turned by a long shaft connected to a winch, mounted inside the cabin next to the door. To turn the entire house, Anders had only to insert a long wooden handle into the winch and crank. The gear ratio was so high that a single man could move the 20-ton structure with slow, steady effort. By November, it was complete. From the outside, it looked bizarre. A small, sturdy cabin sitting on a strange wooden framework, a visible gap between its floor and the cold earth. But Anders had a final touch. He created heavy wooden shutters for the large windows, packed with sheep's wool for insulation. The system was now ready. It was an elegant, integrated machine for living. Its operation was a daily ritual, a dance with the sun. In the morning, just as the first light appeared, Anders would go to the winch. With a series of clicks and groans from the mechanism, he would rotate the entire cabin so the great windows faced the rising sun. As the sun climbed, its light poured through the glass. It was not just light, it was energy. It struck the dark stone floor and the dark clay wall. Dark surfaces, he knew, absorb heat instead of reflecting it. Throughout the day, those stones and that thick wall soaked up the solar radiation, becoming a giant, warm radiator. He was storing the daylight. He would make small adjustments every hour or two, a few turns of the crank, to keep the house pointed directly at the sun, maximizing the intake of energy. His children played in the bright, warm shafts of light that filled the room. His wife, Ingrid, found she could do her sewing without needing a lamp until dusk. As the sun began to set, he performed the final act. He turned the cabin one last time, so the windowless, heavily insulated north wall faced into the prevailing northwest wind, presenting the smallest, strongest possible profile to the coming cold of the night. Then, he and Ingrid would secure the thick, insulated shutters over the windows. The house was now sealed, but the heat it had captured during the day was not lost. The warm stones of the floor and the thermal mass of the back wall began to slowly release their stored energy back into the room. The small wood stove in the corner was needed not as a primary source of heat, but only as a supplement to maintain a comfortable temperature through the coldest hours of the night. He had built a thermal battery, a lung that inhaled sunlight all day and exhaled warmth all night. His neighbors saw only the strange turning. They didn't see the physics at play. They saw a madman spinning his house, and they waited for winter to teach him his lesson. Winter arrived on the last day of December. It did not creep in. It attacked. The settlers called it the Great White Winter of '84, a storm and a cold snap that would become the benchmark for misery for a generation. It began with a sky the color of slate. The temperature, which had been a tolerable 20 degrees Fahrenheit at noon, began to drop. By sunset, it was at 0. The wind picked up, a low moan that grew into a piercing shriek. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but in a blinding horizontal torrent. By the next morning, the world had vanished. There was only the white of the snow and the gray of the sky, whipped into a churning chaos by the wind. The thermometer at the trading post, before it froze solid, read 25 degrees below 0. But the wind made it feel like 50 below. It was a cold that was actively dangerous, a cold that could kill a man in minutes if he was caught unprepared. Inside the traditional cabins, the siege began. The wind forced its way through the chinking, creating tiny, whistling drafts of Arctic air. The fires, which had been kept at a steady bank, now had to be stoked into roaring infernos. The hungry flames devoured wood at a terrifying rate. A cord of wood meant to last a month was gone in a week. Men wrapped themselves in every layer they owned to make desperate, dangerous runs to their wood piles, often just a few yards from their doors, returning with their beards and eyebrows caked in ice. The physical toll was immense. The cold was a constant, draining presence. It leached the strength from their bodies and the hope from their minds. Livestock in the barns, no matter how well protected, began to die. The weak and the elderly were the first to suffer, their coughs echoing in the frigid air of their own homes. Elias Thorne was suffering with them. His cabin, the best built in the settlement, was failing. He had chinked it himself with a master's touch. His fireplace drew perfectly. By all the rules he had ever known, his family should have been secure. But the rules no longer applied. The cold was overwhelming his defenses. He could feel it radiating from the north wall of his home, a palpable presence of deep frost. His wife and 2 small children were huddled under a mountain of blankets, their breath pluming in the air. The water in the barrel by the door was a solid block of ice. He was burning wood at a rate that sickened him. He had already gone through his primary woodpile. Now he was working his way through the seasoned oak he had reserved for making furniture. He had taken his axe to a spare wagon tongue, the frozen wood shattering like glass under the blows. He was a master craftsman, a respected man, and he was failing. The cold was seeping through his expertise, mocking his traditional wisdom. And through his fear and his exhaustion, one thought kept returning to him, a nagging, infuriating thought. The fool, Johansen. He imagined the scene in that glass-walled, spinning shack. He pictured the wind slicing up through the floor, the heat bleeding out those absurdly large windows. He imagined the family, frozen, a testament to the Norwegian's fatal pride. A grim sense of responsibility settled over him. He had called the man a fool, but he hadn't tried hard enough to stop him. If the Johansens were dead, it was partly his fault. On the 4th day of the blizzard, with the wind howling like a demon and the temperature holding at a steady 30 below, Elias made a decision. He had to go and see. He had to know. His wife pleaded with him not to go. It was suicide to be out in this. But he was resolute. He wrapped himself in layers of wool and canvas, pulled a fur hat down over his ears, and tied a scarf over his face, leaving only a slit for his eyes. He took a coiled rope and his axe. The Johansen place was less than half a mile away, but it might as well have been on the moon. The journey was a nightmare. The moment he stepped outside, the wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The snow was not soft powder. It was a granular, wind-blasted crust that was waist-deep in the drifts. Every step was a monumental effort. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. He navigated by instinct, keeping the wind, which he knew was from the northwest, on his right cheek. He thought about turning back a dozen times. His lungs burned with every icy breath. His exposed eyelashes froze together, and he had to claw them apart with his mittened hand. He was guided by a grim vision. Breaking down the door of the spinning shack to find a family frozen in their beds. It was this vision, this sense of duty and dread, that kept him moving forward. After what felt like an eternity, a shape loomed out of the white chaos. The cabin. It was angled strangely, its windowless back wall facing him, hunkered down against the storm like a great beast. He saw immediately that the wind was flowing smoothly over its rounded roof and angled walls, not battering against a flat surface. What he didn't see was smoke. The chimney pipe extending from the roof was clear. There was no plume of gray smoke being torn away by the wind. His heart sank. A fire that had gone out in this cold meant death. There was no other possibility. He stumbled the last few feet to the door, his legs numb, his body shaking with cold and exertion. He raised a heavy mitten and pounded on the thick wood. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He pounded again, harder, shouting Johansen's name. He was about to put his shoulder to the door when he heard a bolt being drawn inside. The door swung inward, and a wave of heat washed over him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a roaring fire. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth, like a perfect summer afternoon. It carried the scent of baking bread and warm pine wood. Elias Thorne stood on the threshold, a figure of ice and snow, and stared into the impossible. Anders Johansen stood before him, holding the door. He was in his shirt sleeves. His face showed only mild surprise at seeing Elias. Beyond him, in the warm, bright light of the cabin, Elias saw a scene of such profound, unbelievable normalcy that it broke his understanding of the world. Ingrid Johansen was pulling a loaf of bread from a small oven set into the side of the wood stove. Steam rose from the golden crust. On the dark stone floor, the two Johansen children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 7, were playing with carved wooden animals. They were barefoot. Barefoot. The word screamed in Elias's mind. His own children were currently wearing every piece of clothing they owned and were still shivering. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. There was no frost on the walls, none. The large shuttered windows were not leaking drafts of cold air. The air itself was warm and still. He looked up at a small thermometer hanging on a wall. He had to squint to read the number. 66 degrees. Anders helped him inside, closing the door and sealing them off from the raging storm. The sudden silence was as shocking as the warmth. "Elias," Anders said, his voice calm, "you are far from home in this weather." Elias was too stunned to speak. He mechanically unwrapped the scarf from his face, his frozen beard crackling as it began to thaw. He was a master builder, an expert. He began to investigate, his professional curiosity overriding his shock. He walked to the wall that faced the wind, the wall he had seen from the outside. He pressed his bare palm against the thick clay plaster. It was warm. Not just neutral, but actively, passively warm to the touch. It was radiating a gentle heat. He turned his attention to the stove. It was a small, efficient cast-iron model, but the fire inside was tiny. A few logs smoldered quietly, the damper turned almost completely shut. It was a fire for maintaining heat, not for desperately creating it. Then his eyes fell on the wood box next to the stove. It was almost full. This, for Elias, was the detail that shattered his reality. In his own home, the wood box was a gaping maw that had to be constantly fed. This small, nearly full box was an accusation. It was proof of a fundamental truth he had arrogantly dismissed. He finally found his voice. It was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Anders, how much wood have you burned?" Anders considered the question for a moment. "Since the storm started? Perhaps a quarter of a cord? Maybe less." A quarter of a cord? Elias felt the number like a physical blow. He had burned through more than a full cord himself. He knew for a fact that the Miller family had already started burning their fence posts. The numbers were stark. They were inarguable. Johansen was using less than a third of the fuel to achieve a level of comfort that was, to Elias, pure fantasy. Elias Thorne, the most respected builder on this stretch of the prairie, a man whose opinion was law when it came to shelter, looked at the quiet Norwegian shipwright. He saw not a fool, but a genius. He felt the full weight of his own ignorance, of his own smug, dismissive pride. He met Anders's eyes, and the expert finally spoke to the innovator. "I was wrong," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. The admission was painful, but it was clean and absolute. "Anders, I was completely wrong. This is a miracle." He gestured around the warm, peaceful room. "You have to teach me. You have to show me how you did this." When the great white winter of '84 finally broke, the stories began to spread. They were carried not by a boastful Anders Johansen, but by a humbled and fervent Elias Thorne. He became the idea's most passionate and credible advocate. He told the story at the trading post, his voice ringing with the conviction of a convert. He described the barefoot children, the warm walls, the full wood box. He explained the principle not as madness, but as irrefutable logic. He had seen the proof with his own eyes, felt the warmth on his own frozen skin. Coming from him, the community's chief skeptic, the testimony was undeniable. The derisive nickname, Johansen's Folly, died overnight. It was now spoken of with a new name, one filled with respect and a touch of awe: the Sun Follower Cabin. That spring, a revolution in construction began on the Dakota Prairie. It was led by Elias Thorne, working side by side with Anders Johansen. 3 new families were building homes that year, and all of them were Sun followers. Anders, who had never sought recognition, now found himself an unlikely teacher. He shared his knowledge of mechanics and leverage freely, sketching designs in the dirt with a stick. Elias, with his deep knowledge of traditional building, helped refine the design. They developed a better bearing system using hardwood rollers that were less reliant on grease. They devised a simpler, more powerful winch mechanism. They learned to calculate the optimal size for the thermal mass wall based on the cabin's square footage. The idea spread from settlement to settlement. Men would ride for 2 days just to see the original cabin and talk to its builder. The Sun Follower became the new standard for any permanent structure built in the region. It fundamentally changed the calculus of survival. The impact was profound and measurable. Families found their winter fuel consumption cut by more than half, sometimes by 2/3. This freed up hundreds of hours of back-breaking labor that could now be devoted to other tasks: mending tools, tending to livestock, educating children. Winter lost some of its terror. It was still a harsh and dangerous season, but it was no longer a months-long siege that left families exhausted and depleted. The Sun Follower cabins were not just shelters. They were sanctuaries of warmth and light in the darkest time of the year. Anders Johansen never sought a patent. He never asked for payment for his designs. His reward was seeing the plume of smoke from his neighbors' chimneys shrink, knowing their children were warm. He remained a quiet, humble man, more comfortable with a saw and a plane than with the praise of his community. He had solved a problem, the most important problem in his world, and that was enough for him. The true legacy of his invention wasn't measured in cords of wood saved or degrees of temperature gained. It was measured in human terms. It was measured in the babies who survived their first winter, in the elderly who could live with dignity and comfort, and in the simple, profound luxury of a family being able to sit down for a meal in the evening without having to huddle for warmth around a fire. It was the gift of a home that was truly a haven. The story of Anders Johansen and his rotating cabin is a powerful reminder. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and radical innovation, and the courage it takes to trust an idea that everyone else calls foolish. It demonstrates that sometimes the most elegant solutions come from looking at a problem from a completely different angle, not as a builder, but as a shipwright, not as someone fighting the cold, but as someone harvesting the warmth. The arrogance of established expertise often creates the biggest blind spots. It was only when the expert, Elias Thorne, was willing to admit he was wrong that progress was truly possible. The principles Anders used, passive solar gain, thermal mass, and strategic orientation, are now foundational concepts in modern sustainable architecture. The Sunfollower cabin was, in its own way, a perfect machine, an elegant, low-tech engine for survival, powered by the oldest and most reliable energy source in our sky. If this story of forgotten genius resonated with you, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribe for more tales of historical innovation that changed the world in quiet ways. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What's the most clever, low-tech solution to a problem you've ever encountered? The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles of passive solar design, thermal mass, and rotating structures are real and have been used in various forms throughout history, the characters, specific events, and location are a composite narrative. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional architectural or engineering advice.